The Suicide Squad. So I wasn't actually planning on making a video about this at all, but there are a lot of interesting things about this film, especially how it compares to the 2016 film, which we'll talk about more in just a second. There's a lot of interesting things for me to explore, especially from a filmmaking point of view. Before we do so, just wanted to give a few thoughts maybe on the movie as a whole. I think it is a very enjoyable, fun film. It is vibrant and exciting and dynamic in more ways than one. The characters are terrific, and I think a film like Suicide Squad, the mission is usually always very kind of simple and straightforward and somewhat self-explanatory. What I liked is that James Gunn was able to take this mission and sort of pivot and, take it in directions that aren't always the expected outcome. That's good. But really, the Suicide Squad films are ultimately, just like the comics or the animated films, very character-driven movies. And, very character-driven stories, because ultimately I think that's where the most interesting part of this dynamic and this kind of story lies. And so what I really enjoyed about this film was how James Gunn was able to take these basically B, C, D list characters and elevate them, to A-list material, except the Harley Quinn character, which we'll talk about in just a second. But, he was able to really take these characters, make us care about them, and yet also kind of subvert expectations in a really interesting way. Because, of course, the relationship and the dynamic between this squad is built up a lot. And, he's able to kind of eliminate certain squad members in ways that make you feel both entertained and shocked, but also just really emotional. And so I just really admire the fact that he was able to take these lesser known sort of nobody characters essentially and elevate them to this level. Now, of course, as everyone's already said, one of the main issues with this is it makes Harley Quinn stick out like a sore thumb, because that they're never going to kill off Margot Robbie. It's just not going to happen. And so that part of it, of course, sort of takes you out of the experience a little bit, but at the same time, she did have a lot of really great scenes and was overall a really kind of entertaining part of the film. I also think that as a writer, James Gunn was able to bring a lot of interesting elements into the film that perhaps other writers may not have done in the exact same way. And that was primarily, for me, the opening sequence and ultimately the way James Gunn subverts expectations. Because I believe that the Suicide Squad, by default, is one of those stories and one of those properties where you can do so in a way that's not annoying and not unearned. Because you can kill off these characters and you can just have them literally drop like flies. That's literally the whole point of this story and this squad. They're not like a Justice League or an Avengers or Game of Thrones or a Star Wars, where you have to stick quite religiously to who lives, who dies, and everything else, and put so much weight and care and concern into that. Whereas here, the whole point is that you can kill them off at a moment's notice. And of course, in that opening scene, they do. I genuinely think that the opening 15-20 minutes has got to be one of the more interesting openings to a film, just because of the way it was handled and the way he kind of tricked us. I almost wish that this film had no trailer. And even if they did have a trailer, I wish that it was marketed around that first squad, because it would have been so fun to sit there and watch, the Jai Courtney team with the, Nathan Fillion and all the rest go into this mission, and Michael Rooker and the Weasel go into this mission, and you think, okay, so this is our Suicide Squad, let's go. And then they all drop dead in really gory and entertaining ways, especially Captain Boomerang. They all have really fun, entertaining deaths within the first 10 minutes. And then you switch and then you go, oh, this is the actual Suicide Squad with the Idris Elba and John Cena and, the other characters. That would have been so much fun, I think. But yeah, that's just sort of my initial thoughts on the story and the characters and the way that the film played out. I very much enjoyed that side of it. But what I enjoyed even more, which I want to elaborate on now, is the filmmaking. because I genuinely think that James Gunn, with each film he makes, constantly is leveling up as a director. And his craft is just getting more refined and more interesting and more dynamic. And the best way for me to convey this is, unfortunately, by comparing it to the 2016 film. Now, of course, before we do that comparison, it is paramount that I address the elephant in the room, which is that the 2016 film is not David Ayer's movie. All right, it is not 100% David Ayer's film. And so it is not a James Gunn comparison with David Ayer kind of thing, you know, in the same way that you could have compared the Zack Snyder versus Joss Whedon thing. This is a very different situation because David Ayer was basically not fully allowed to complete and fulfill his vision. That said, from what I know about the behind the scenes situation, 2016 Suicide Squad was not like a Justice League where they fired Ayer, brought someone else in and had them do reshoots, and therefore it was actually a different director shooting certain scenes. David Ayer was basically on set and filmed, you know, the majority of the movie until the reshoots happened, of which I also believe he was on set and directed those reshoots as well. All right, so this is not like they brought someone else in and it's two directors within one movie. This is still very much directed by David Ayer, but of course, a lot of the editing, a lot of the transitions, a lot of the overall style, as well as the story and the outcome and the scenes that were deleted, the way they took scenes and sort of chopped them up, was not up to him. And so I will never call this David Ayer's Suicide Squad. If anything, that 2016 film, there are a lot of interesting comparisons that can be made. And if one were to explore it from a filmmaking point of view, it has a lot of pros and cons, and overall it's actually quite an interesting film to look at, independent of all the different horrible changes that were made. And ultimately the reason I say this, and the reason I believe these two films are such brilliant companion pieces, aside from the fact that, you know, they're both Suicide Squad films, is the fact that one film really relies on the literal aspect of filmmaking and the other one doesn't. And what I mean by that is, with the 2016 Suicide Squad, it felt like whoever directed that movie, whichever member of the studio decided to change it, read the script and thought, how do I film this? How do I film this script? But with the Suicide Squad 2021, it really feels like the director looked at it and thought, how do I film this? A really good example of this, another really good example, would be the Thor films. You know, Taika Waititi's personality is on every frame of Thor Ragnarok. No one can direct that movie but him. He looked at that script and thought, what do I bring as a director? Where does my personality come in? How do I really make this movie feel like it's a part of me? Whereas you look at Thor: The Dark World with Alan Taylor, which is, you know, it's not a badly directed film. It's very competently done. It's a lot of nice shots and nice moments and stuff. But it very much felt like the director just looked at the script and just filmed the script. You know, if it says character walks from A to B, it's just a shot of character walking from A to B. And that is so evident with the 2016 versus 2021 Suicide Squad. You look at a shot from the 2016 film of these, you know, characters walking, and it's just this medium shot of them walking, and that's it. Whereas you look at James Gunn, characters walking, it goes from one side into Idris Elba into the next. The camera is always moving. There's always something interesting going on. You look at the opening scene, or the first shot of one of the main characters or one of the characters. With 2016, you get this shot of Will Smith that is like half a second long. Again, David Ayer might not have had full control of the editing, but still, it's this kind of dark, dimly lit shot of a guy punching a bag. But then you go to James Gunn's version, and it's this opening shot, which is stunning, by the way. And it is just insane that, like, they went the extra mile. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is, with the 2016 version, they just kind of filmed stuff happening. Whereas with 2021, it was really, really intentional. And at every single point, James Gunn looks at the script and probably went, how do I make this more visually interesting? How do I make this more dynamic? How do I make this really, really kind of pop? But there's one of my favorite shots in the entire film, spoiler alert, is when John Cena and Joel Kinnaman fight, and you see a portion of this fight shown through the reflection of Peacemaker's helmet. I mean, what the like, that is just so cool. And it's, again, a director really going that extra mile to kind of going out of their way to make it as interesting as possible. You look at 2016 Suicide Squad, and there are so many things that you could have done like that, similar to that. You know, you really could have had like a katana fight scene where you have her enemy sort of reflected through her sword. Deadshot, I mean, that is just, you could have milked so much out of that, and yet it's just Will Smith shooting people, you know? The small amount of time we have with Captain Boomerang in this film is far more interesting and a far more fun depiction of his powers than you ever see him in the 2016 film. So obviously I would say that one of the things that James Gunn does so brilliantly in this film is utilizing the different departments of the filmmaking process to elevate the overall story. This is the kind of stuff I believe every filmmaker should be sort of aspiring to work on, you know, this kind of level. Every scene, honestly, you know, gets very close to looking like a comic book. And very few directors within the genre have really been able to replicate the look and feel of a comic book. I think Taika Waititi's gotten very close. Matthew Vaughn with the Kick-Ass films and Kingsman, perhaps. Robert Rodriguez with Sin City. But here with the Suicide Squad, I think James Gunn does a bloody good job of really creating these images. You know, the taller aspect ratio helps, of course, to make it look and feel more like an illustration, but he really does bring a certain kind of vibrance and color that almost feels too good to be true, that feels larger than life, that feels like something you wouldn't expect to see in the real world, you know, which is a complete stark contrast to the desaturated and gritty, grounded style of David Ayer's film, whether it be End of Watch or Fury, and of course 2016 Suicide Squad. And, you know, so each scene within the 2021 version, it just pops. And each scene feels different. Each scene feels unique. And so ultimately, I guess what I'm trying to say, and the one thing I think we can all learn from this comparison, is that filmmakers can always and should always go the extra mile to visually elevate their movies. And I think James Gunn has really been able to pull that off, whether it be in action, in comedy, in shots of people just walking and talking. He's really been able to take it and elevate it. And the ultimate message here is that the whole point of directors is you come and you elevate the script and you turn it into something that is special. And I really, really think that that was what James Gunn was able to do with 2021's Suicide Squad.